October 1944, Western Germany. The sky over the airfield is quiet, unnaturally so. Then the sound arrives, sharp and unfamiliar. Not the steady pulse of piston engines, but a clean, tearing roar that cuts through the cold air in seconds. Ground crews look up. Officers pause mid-sentence. The aircraft streaks past faster than anything they have ever seen. A jet fighter. Within days, reports ripple outward. Allied pilots encounter something new. Radar operators struggle to track it. Intelligence summaries are rewritten. Newspapers hint at secret weapons. For a moment, the world believes it is witnessing a turning point. Germany has unveiled another breakthrough. Across Europe, across the Atlantic, the reaction is the same. Shock, admiration, unease. Engineers study photographs. Commanders debate counters. The question forms quickly and urgently. Has the balance just changed? But on the ground, beneath the spectacle, something remains unchanged. Trains still arrive short of fuel. Factories still struggle to replace losses. Front lines still bend the same way they did yesterday. The aircraft vanishes as quickly as it appeared. The war continues. Germany has shocked the world before. It will do so again. Yet with every revelation, the same quiet truth lingers beneath the noise. Shock does not always mean movement. And in this war, movement is everything. Germany's faith in breakthroughs did not emerge from desperation alone. It was shaped by experience. Experience that, early in the war, seemed to prove that shock could decide outcomes faster than endurance ever could. In 1939 and 1940, Germany fought a kind of war the world was unprepared for. Poland collapsed in weeks. France fell in 6. Radios coordinated armor and aircraft in real time. Speed replaced mass. Surprise replaced attrition. To German planners, this was not luck. It was confirmation. Innovation had worked. The early campaigns validated a belief already embedded in German military culture, that decisive advantage came from qualitative superiority, not numerical depth. Germany knew it lacked the raw material reserves of its potential enemies. It could not match the industrial output of the United States or the manpower of the Soviet Union in a prolonged struggle. The solution, therefore, was to avoid prolonged struggle altogether. Breakthroughs were not luxuries, they were necessities. This thinking shaped procurement, doctrine, and leadership expectations well before the war expanded beyond Europe. German weapons development prioritized performance at the edge of what was possible. Faster aircraft, heavier tanks, more powerful guns. Designs were pushed aggressively forward, even when reliability suffered. In the early years, this gamble paid off often enough to become habit. The panzer divisions that rolled into France were not superior in numbers, they were superior in coordination. The Luftwaffe did not dominate because it had more aircraft, but because it integrated air power directly into ground operations. These were not isolated innovations, they were breakthroughs in how war was fought. The success reinforced a dangerous assumption, that the next leap would always arrive in time. As the war widened, this assumption hardened into doctrine. When Britain did not collapse in 1940, Germany looked to new aircraft and submarines to force the issue. When the invasion of the Soviet Union stalled, planners turned to heavier armor, longer-range guns, and improved engines. Each challenge was met not with simplification, but with escalation in complexity. Germany was not ignoring logistics or production, it was subordinating them. The belief was clear. If a weapon could change the battlefield decisively, the system would adapt around it. Performance would justify strain, shock would compensate for scarcity. This belief was not irrational, it was rooted in German history and experience. In the First World War, Germany had introduced stormtrooper tactics, new artillery methods, and chemical weapons that nearly broke stalemates. In the interwar period, German military thinkers studied how innovation could restore maneuver to modern warfare. Blitzkrieg was not improvisation, it was theory realized. The problem was not that Germany misunderstood innovation, it was that Germany overestimated its ability to repeat it indefinitely. As the war entered its second phase, this overconfidence met a radically different reality. The enemies Germany now faced were not brittle. The Soviet Union absorbed losses and continued fighting. Britain endured bombing and adapted. The United States entered the war with industrial capacity unmatched by any nation in history. These opponents did not require a single decisive defeat to collapse. They required sustained pressure, and they could apply it themselves. Germany responded by intensifying its search for breakthroughs. Jet propulsion promised air superiority restored. Rocket weapons promised to bypass defenses entirely.
Heavy tanks promised battlefield dominance even against superior numbers. Advanced submarines promised to sever supply lines faster than replacements could arrive. Each project made sense in isolation. Together, they revealed a strategic addiction. By 1943, Germany was investing enormous resources into weapons that promised dramatic effect, but only under ideal conditions. These systems demanded specialized materials, highly trained crews, and uninterrupted production. They were brilliant, but fragile. They could shock observers. They could not endure systemic stress. Yet belief persisted. German leadership increasingly framed these weapons not as supplements, but as solutions. Each delay was justified by the promise of what was coming next. Each setback was met with renewed emphasis on innovation. The war was recast as a race, one more leap ahead before the enemy's mass could fully materialize. This framing shaped expectations on every level. Engineers worked under intense pressure to deliver performance beyond proven limits. Pilots transitioned to radically new aircraft with minimal training. Commanders planned operations around weapons that existed only in small numbers. Faith filled gaps that logistics could not. The irony was that Germany's breakthroughs often arrived exactly as promised. Jets flew, rockets launched, heavy tanks rolled, submarines improved. The shock was real. What Germany failed to grasp was that the war itself had changed. It no longer responded to shock the way it had in 1940. The scale was too large, the systems too deep, the momentum too distributed. Breakthroughs now entered a battlefield already shaped by production curves, replacement pipelines, and logistical reach. To matter, they would need not just to outperform existing weapons, but to do so repeatedly, at scale, under constant pressure. That requirement was never fully acknowledged. Instead, Germany continued to believe that awe could still substitute for accumulation, that surprise could still compensate for endurance, that the next revelation would not merely impress, but alter direction. This belief carried Germany forward into the final years of the war. It would produce some of the most remarkable machines ever built. It would also collide with a reality that no amount of brilliance could reverse. And as those breakthroughs began to appear in combat, the world would indeed be shocked, just not in the way Germany expected. By the time Germany's breakthroughs began to appear in earnest, the war they entered was no longer the war Germany had designed them for. Between 1931 and 1943, the conflict transformed in scale and character. What had once been a series of fast-moving campaigns hardened into a global industrial struggle. Fronts stretched thousands of kilometers, armies numbered in the millions, losses were counted not in battalions but in divisions. Time itself became a weapon. This transformation mattered more than any single invention. In earlier wars, shock could collapse systems because systems were shallow. Command structures were brittle, logistics were limited. Break a line, seize a capital, destroy a field army, and the war could end. In 1940, France collapsed not because it lacked courage or equipment, but because its system could not absorb sudden disruption. By 1943, the major powers had learned. The Soviet Union rebuilt entire armies after catastrophic losses. Britain reorganized its air defenses, industry, and command structure under sustained attack. The United States constructed an unprecedented global network of production, training, and transport. These systems were no longer centralized targets that could be shattered by surprise. They were distributed. Factories were spread across continents, training bases multiplied, supply routes diversified, command was layered, redundant, and adaptive. A shock in one place produced adjustment elsewhere, not collapse. This was the environment Germany's breakthroughs entered. Jet aircraft could outrun escorts, but they could not be everywhere. Rocket weapons could bypass defenses, but they could not be guided with precision or deployed in decisive numbers. Heavy tanks could dominate local engagements, but they consumed fuel, demanded maintenance, and could not be replaced quickly. The war no longer rewarded isolated superiority, it rewarded continuity. Allied forces were no longer attempting to avoid shock, they were designing to absorb it. Losses were anticipated, measured, and replaced. New tactics were tested in combat and refined quickly because the underlying system remained intact even when individual units were destroyed. This adaptability was decisive. When German submarines introduced new tactics or technologies, Allied convoys adjusted routes, escorts, and detection methods. When German aircraft appeared with superior speed or altitude, Allied fighters altered engagement profiles and increased numbers. When German armor proved formidable, Allied forces emphasized air power, artillery, and logistics to neutralize it. In each case, the response was not a counter-breakthrough, it was adjustment. This is the critical shift Germany failed to fully internalize. Breakthroughs mattered most in wars where the enemy lacked the ability to respond systemically. By 1943, Germany's enemies were defined entirely by their systems. The United States in particular did not treat the war as a series of decisive moments. It treated it as a continuous process. Production targets were measured monthly. Training output was tracked statistically. Losses were integrated into planning rather than feared. Commanders were evaluated not just on tactical success, but on their ability to sustain operations. In this framework, shock became data. A new German weapon triggered analysis, not panic. Engineers studied it, pilots reported on it, tactics were adjusted, production increased where necessary. The system incorporated the shock and moved forward. Germany's leadership often interpreted the initial reaction to its breakthroughs as evidence of their effectiveness. Intelligence reports described Allied concern. Newspapers speculated. Pilots were startled. For a moment, it felt like 1940 again. But beneath that surface reaction, the deeper mechanisms of war continued unchanged. Convoys still crossed the Atlantic, bomber formations still stumbled, armies still received replacements. The direction of the front lines did not reverse, timelines did not shift meaningfully. This disconnect was crucial. Germany measured success by reaction, the Allies measured success by trajectory. By late 1943, Allied trajectory was already set. Production curves favored them overwhelmingly, training pipelines were mature, logistics networks were established across multiple theaters. Even major setbacks could not derail momentum for long. Germany's breakthroughs invited into this momentum like stones dropped into a river. They created ripples, they did not change the current. The reason was not just numerical superiority, it was organizational maturity. Allied systems had been tested, damaged, repaired, and expanded repeatedly. They had learned through failure. By contrast, many German breakthrough systems were entering combat for the first time, untested at scale, and without the depth needed to survive prolonged use. The war had become less about what a weapon could do at its best, and more about what it could do on its worst day, when fuel was short, crews were.
Behind every German breakthroughs stood people asked to do extraordinary things under ordinary human limits. Pilots transitioning to jet aircraft did so with minimal hours. Fuel shortages restricted training. Manuals lagged behind reality. Ground crews learned by improvisation, maintaining machines that demanded precision in environments defined by scarcity. Tank crews climbed into vehicles whose performance inspired confidence, but whose reliability inspired caution. These were not second-rate personnel. They were often among Germany's most capable. But capability could not erase exhaustion. Operating a breakthrough weapon required constant attention. Minor errors carried disproportionate consequences. Engines overheated, components failed early. Repairs consumed time that no longer existed. Each mission demanded focus not just on the enemy, but on the machine itself. This burden accumulated psychologically. Crews sensed the gap between promise and practice. They flew aircraft that impressed observers, yet struggled to complete sorties consistently. They commanded tanks that dominated head-on engagements, but broke down before reaching the battlefield. Pride coexisted with frustration. And frustration, in war, corrodes confidence. The human cost of brilliance without support was not just loss, it was fatigue without relief. Angle 2, the technological angle, why performance wasn't enough. Germany's breakthroughs were often genuinely advanced. Jet propulsion, swept wings, rocket assistance, heavy armor, advanced optics, these were not illusions. They represented real technical progress. But technology exists inside context. Advanced systems require margins, fuel, time, skilled labor, redundancy. Germany's breakthroughs were engineered near the limits of available materials and manufacturing tolerance. Under laboratory conditions, they performed. Under battlefield stress, they degraded quickly. Reliability lagged behind capability. This gap mattered more than headline performance. An aircraft that flew faster but less often could not shift air superiority. A tank that won duels but required constant maintenance could not anchor operations. A weapon that shocked once but could not be repeated became a curiosity. Allied technology followed a different logic. It emphasized good enough performance delivered reliably. Designs were simplified, parts were standardized, maintenance was integrated into planning. Innovation was introduced gradually once systems could support it. The result was not technological stagnation, but technological stability. Germany's breakthroughs dazzled because they were ahead of their time. They failed because they arrived without the ecosystem that time would later provide. Angle 3, the leadership angle, when innovation became a substitute. As the war turned against Germany, leadership increasingly framed innovation as salvation. Each new weapon was presented as a turning point. Expectations rose accordingly. This narrative mattered. It shaped morale, planning, and resource allocation. Programs were protected because abandoning them felt like surrender. Delays were tolerated because promise still existed. This mindset had consequences. Resources flowed towards complexity instead of consolidation. Production lines multiplied rather than converged. Training pipelines shortened to accelerate deployment. Leadership gambled that the next reveal would arrive before the system collapsed. This was not ignorance. It was denial shaped by urgency. Leadership struggled to accept that the war could no longer be decided by shock, that reality required a different response, simplification, standardization, and acceptance of attrition that Germany was structurally unprepared to implement late in the conflict. Innovation became not a tool but a refuge. Angle 4, the enemy angle, how the Allies experienced the shock. To Allied forces, German breakthroughs were unsettling, but rarely paralyzing. Pilots encountering jet aircraft reported surprise, then adaptation. Intelligence units studied wreckage. Engineers assessed performance limits. Tactics adjusted. Escort coverage increased. Production numbers compensated. The result was procedural. Allied systems treated shock as input, not catastrophe.
Losses triggered reviews. Reviews produced adjustments. Adjustments were implemented at scale. The system absorbed novelty without changing direction. This contrast was stark. German breakthroughs aimed to force reaction. Allied systems aimed to manage it. As a result, the psychological impact faded quickly. Awe gave way to familiarity. Familiarity gave way to countermeasures. Within weeks, what had shocked the world became another variable in planning. Breakthroughs did not fail because they were ineffective. They failed because their effects were temporary, and temporary effects could not alter a war defined by accumulation. Angle 5, the moral angle. Hope concentrated in machines. Perhaps the most damaging effect of Germany's breakthrough strategy was moral. As conventional options narrowed, hope concentrated around machines. Each new weapon carried symbolic weight. It promised not just capability, but redemption. When results failed to match expectation, disappointment cut deeply. Morale became volatile. Successes were magnified emotionally. Failures were devastating. The gap between promise and outcome widened, eroding trust in leadership and planning. Soldiers began to wait for solutions rather than adapt to reality. Allied morale moved differently. Confidence rested not on revelation, but on repetition. Supplies arrived, units rotated. The war felt exhausting, but manageable. This steadiness mattered more than inspiration. Hope built on systems endured. Hope built on miracles did not. By late 1944, this contrast was visible everywhere. Germany continued to unveil remarkable weapons. The world continued to react, and the war continued unchanged. Shock had lost its leverage. What remained was pressure, and the question of how long brilliance could survive without the structures needed to sustain it. That question would be answered decisively in the war's final phase, when Germany's most dramatic breakthroughs met a battlefield that no longer cared how extraordinary they were. Angle 6, the industrial angle. Brilliance without scale. Germany's breakthrough suffered from a problem that no amount of ingenuity could overcome: scale. Advanced weapons were difficult to produce even under ideal conditions. By the later years of the war, conditions were anything but ideal. Strategic bombing disrupted factories. Skilled labor was scarce. Raw materials were inconsistent. Production was forced underground or dispersed, reducing efficiency and quality control. Under these pressures, breakthroughs became boutique achievements. Jet fighters were built in small numbers. Rocket weapons consumed enormous resources for limited effect. Heavy tanks rolled off assembly lines too slowly to replace losses. Each system required specialized parts, unique training, and dedicated maintenance infrastructure. The result was fragmentation. Instead of one coherent production effort, Germany managed dozens of parallel programs competing for dwindling resources. Output looked impressive in photographs and intelligence briefings, but it could not be multiplied fast enough to matter. The Allies, by contrast, focused relentlessly on scale. They simplified designs to increase throughput. They standardized components across models. They accepted incremental improvement over radical change. Production numbers climbed steadily even as losses mounted. Scale turned shock into noise. No matter how advanced a German weapon appeared, it faced an enemy that could replace losses faster than Germany could deliver novelty. The arithmetic of war overwhelmed the spectacle of innovation. Angle 7, the logistical angle. Weapons that could not travel. A breakthrough weapon must reach the battlefield to matter. Germany increasingly struggled to make that happen. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and immobilized tanks. Rail lines were damaged. Roads were under constant air attack. Even when advanced weapons were available, moving them into position became an ordeal. Units received equipment without the means to use it fully. Logistics did not merely support combat, it defined its limits. Germany's breakthroughs often consumed more fuel, required more maintenance, and demanded more specialized support than older systems. In a logistical environment already collapsing, this was catastrophic. Weapons that promised superiority in combat could not be sustained long enough to influence operations. Allied logistics worked differently. They were built first, expanded continuously, and protected aggressively. Ports were secured and enlarged. Supply routes were redundant. Fuel flowed in quantities Germany could no longer imagine. This difference ensured that Allied forces fought with what they had planned for, while German forces fought with what they could still move. Angle 10, the temporal angle. Innovation that arrived too late. Time matters as much as capability. Many German breakthroughs arrived at moments when strategic options were already closing. Even if these weapons had performed flawlessly, they would have needed time to reshape doctrine, training, and production. Time Germany no longer possessed. Jets appeared when air superiority was already lost. Rockets arrived when cities were already devastated. Heavy tanks emerged when fuel shortages limited their use. Innovation could no longer propagate. Allied systems, by contrast, had matured early. Adjustments could be integrated quickly because the underlying structure already existed. Time favored those who had prepared for duration, not those who chased acceleration. Germany's breakthroughs shocked because they were new. They failed because they were late. Angle 9, the strategic angle. Shock without direction. Breakthroughs are effective when they align with strategy. By late war, Germany's strategy had narrowed to survival. New weapons were deployed reactively, not as part of a coherent campaign. Jets were used for interception without the numbers to control airspace. Rockets were fired for terror rather than operational gain. Heavy tanks defended positions they could not hold. Shock became isolated. Each breakthrough operated alone, unsupported by complementary systems. Without integration, their effects remained local and temporary. They could not reinforce one another. They could not accumulate. Allied operations, on contrast, were systemic. Air power supported ground advances. Logistics sustained momentum. Intelligence fed planning. Each element amplified the others. Shock was unnecessary because pressure was constant. Germany's breakthroughs had no framework to live inside. Angle 10, the psychological angle. When awe turned to indifference. Perhaps the clearest sign that Germany's breakthroughs had lost meaning was psychological. Early revelations provoked alarm. Later ones provoked curiosity. By the end, they provoked resignation. Awe faded. When shock becomes expected, it loses power. Germany can continue to astonish technically. The world continued to adapt. The gap between revelation and relevance widened until it disappeared entirely. Breakthroughs had become background noise. By the final months of the war, Germany could still surprise, but surprise no longer translated into leverage. The system pressing in from all sides remained intact, unmoved by spectacle. The war no longer responded to what was new. It responded only to what could continue. And as Germany exhausted itself unveiling the extraordinary, the ordinary machinery of Allied power moved forward without pause, setting the stage for the decisive moments when shock would finally be overtaken by consequence.
Late 1944. Europe. Germany's breakthroughs finally arrive, not as rumors or prototypes, but as operational realities. Jet fighters cut across the sky faster than Allied escorts. Rockets fall without warning, bypassing every defense built to stop aircraft. Heavy tanks appear on battlefields where nothing comparable has existed before. For observers, the effect is undeniable. Intelligence summaries grow urgent. Allied pilots report encounters they cannot immediately explain. Civilian populations experience weapons that arrive without sound or warning. Newspapers speak carefully, but the implication is clear. Germany still possesses the capacity to astonish. This is the peak of German technological shock. The jet fighter, faster, higher, and briefly untouchable, forces immediate reassessment. Early encounters favor the new aircraft. Allied pilots struggle to engage. Ground controllers track targets that outrun expectations. The gap between what existed yesterday and what exists today feels sudden. Rockets intensify that sensation. They do not seek air superiority, they bypass it entirely. They represent something new, a weapon that cannot be intercepted once launched. Cities are struck without warning. The psychological effect is profound. Civilians understand that no siren can provide safety. Commanders confront a threat that ignores established doctrine. Heavy armor completes the picture. On the ground, German tanks shrug off hits that would destroy earlier designs. Allied units learn quickly that frontal engagement is costly. Reports describe machines that seem invulnerable in head-on combat. The battlefield adjusts in real time. For a brief period, Germany's vision appears vindicated. These weapons do exactly what breakthroughs are meant to do. They disrupt assumptions. They force reaction. They remind the world that Germany remains capable of producing the extraordinary. But beneath this spectacle, another reality persists. The breakthroughs do not appear in numbers sufficient to dominate space. Jets are few, fuel-hungry, and maintenance-intensive. Rockets consume enormous resources for limited strategic effect. Heavy tanks are powerful, but slow to replace, difficult to move, and vulnerable to air attack and logistics collapse. Each breakthrough shocks locally. None alters the broader pattern. Allied forces respond not with panic, but with process. Tactics shift. Escorts adjust altitude and timing. Engagements are avoided where risk outweighs reward. Intelligence units catalog performance limits. Production increases where losses rise. Training updates propagate through units rapidly. The system reacts. Shock creates motion, but not direction. Jets win moments in the air, but they do not stop bomber streams. Rockets terrify cities, but they do not slow armies. Heavy tanks dominate encounters, but they cannot hold ground without fuel and support. Each weapon achieves its design purpose in isolation. None achieve strategic reversal. This disconnect defines the turning point. Germany has done what it set out to do. It has shocked the world again. The problem is not effectiveness, it is accumulation. The war now demands effects that persist day after day, across fronts, under pressure. Germany's breakthroughs arrive like lightning. The war is now a storm. As weeks pass, the initial awe fades into familiarity. Allied pilots learn when jets are vulnerable, during takeoff and landing, when fuel is low, when speed becomes constrained. Countermeasures emerge, engagements become predictable, losses stabilize. The same pattern repeats on the ground. Heavy tanks are bypassed, isolated, or destroyed by combined arms. Rockets provoke outrage, not strategic recalibration. The system absorbs shock and resumes forward motion. This is the moment when the paradox becomes undeniable. Germany's breakthroughs are real. They are also irrelevant to outcome. The world has watched the future arrive early and then watched the war continue unchanged. The realization is subtle but decisive. No matter how extraordinary the weapon, it cannot matter unless it can be repeated, sustained, and integrated. Germany has reached the limit of what shock alone can achieve. What remains is consequence. And consequence will not be shaped by what astonishes observers,
but by what survives pressure long enough to accumulate effect. That pressure is now relentless. By early 1945, the pattern had settled. Germany's breakthroughs were no longer mysteries. They were known quantities, studied, measured, and folded into Allied planning. The moment of astonishment had passed. What remained was arithmetic. Jets still flew, rockets still fell, heavy tanks still fought. But each appearance now raised the same question inside Allied headquarters. How many? How often? For how long? The answers were never sufficient. Jet units struggled to sustain operations. Fuel shortages limited sorties. Engines were out quickly. Airfields became predictable targets. Allied air superiority, briefly disrupted, reasserted itself through numbers, coordination, and persistence. Bomber streams continued. Escorts adapted. Losses stabilized. The sky did not change hands. Rocket attacks continued as well. They struck cities and killed civilians. They consumed enormous industrial effort, but they did not alter Allied operational tempo. Ports still functioned. Armies still advanced. Production continued uninterrupted. The rockets achieved terror, but terror without leverage. On the ground, heavy armor fought fiercely in localized engagements. Allied units respected its power. They adjusted tactics, avoided direct confrontation when possible, and applied air power and artillery where it was decisive. Tanks that could not be repaired or refueled became immobile fortresses, then wrecks. The breakthroughs were contained. This containment was not dramatic. It did not appear in headlines. It occurred through procedure, briefings, checklists, after-action reports, adjustments repeated across units until novelty disappeared. Germany's leadership now faced a reality it had delayed for years. The breakthroughs had arrived. The war had not moved. There was no longer another revelation waiting in reserve, no next leap that could restore shock. The pipeline of extraordinary solutions had been exhausted. What remained were incremental improvements arriving into a collapsing structure. By contrast, Allied systems were reaching peak efficiency. Production was at full stride. Training pipelines were mature. Logistics networks spanned continents. Losses were still heavy, but they no longer threatened continuity. The system had passed the point where disruption could change direction. This is the true turning point. Not when Germany unveiled its most advanced weapons, but when it became clear that unveiling them no longer mattered. From this moment on, Germany's breakthroughs functioned as symbols rather than tools. They represented what Germany could do, not what it could still influence. Each new deployment carried emotional weight, but diminishing strategic value. The Allies recognized this shift quickly. Operations were planned with confidence, timelines extended without fear of sudden reversal, resources were allocated based on capacity, not contingency. The war entered its final phase not with uncertainty, but with momentum. Germany's remaining efforts turned inward. Innovation continued, but without expectation. Engineers refined designs knowing they would not be produced at scale. Pilots flew advanced aircraft knowing replacement. Commanders commit elite units knowing there would be no relief. Shock had given to resignation. This transition was subtle but absolute. The war no longer revolved around what Germany might reveal next. It revolved around how long Germany could continue resisting pressure it could no longer deflect. By spring 1945, fronts collapsed not because of sudden technological defeat, but because the system supporting resistance had finally been consumed. Supply failed, movement stopped, command fractured. The breakthrough still existed, but they stood isolated amid exhaustion. The world had been shocked. The war had been decided elsewhere. In retrospect, the decisive moment was not the first jet flight, the first rocket launch, or the appearance at the heaviest tank. It was the moment when those events ceased to provoke strategic recalculation. From that point forward, outcome was no longer in question. Only aftermath remained. And in that aftermath, the true meaning of Germany's breakthroughs would be measured, not by what they revealed about the future, but by what they failed to change in the present.
When the fighting ended, Germany's breakthroughs were still visible. Burned-out hulks on roadsides, craters in cities, abandoned aircraft on airfields. They remained striking, even in defeat. Yet, when measured against the war's outcome, their impact narrowed sharply. Tactically, some of these weapons had worked. Jets disrupted bomber formations briefly, heavy tanks forced Allied units to adjust tactics, rockets inflicted casualties and fear. In isolated moments, German breakthroughs achieved exactly what they were designed to do.
Strategically, they achieved almost nothing. The war's major trajectories, industrial output, territorial control, manpower balance, continued unchanged. Allied armies advanced, air superiority remained intact, production curves did not bend, replacement pipelines did not slow. The breakthroughs did not fail because they were ineffective. They failed because they could not accumulate effect. Each system demanded disproportionate investment, specialized materials, highly trained crews, unique infrastructure, maintenance hours that consumed more effort than results justified. In a war already constrained by shortages, this imbalance mattered. Resources diverted to breakthrough programs were resources not spent elsewhere. Simpler aircraft that could have been produced in larger numbers were delayed or canceled. Standardization suffered. Logistics fractured further. The pursuit of the extraordinary crowded out the management of the essential. The opportunity cost was immense. Breakthroughs also distorted decision-making. Because they inspired awe, they encouraged overconfidence. Leadership delayed hard choices, believing the next deployment would alter the situation. This postponed consolidation, retreat, or negotiation. Time was spent waiting for solutions rather than adapting to limits. The psychological effect lingered even as evidence mounted. For those operating the breakthroughs, the aftermath was deeply personal. Pilots and crews recognized the contradiction. They flew machines that felt like the future into a war that no longer had space for it. Successes felt hollow, losses felt final. Pride and capability coexisted with frustration and futility. Morale eroded not through defeat alone, but through recognition. Allied assessments after the war reflected this clarity. Intelligence reports concluded that Germany's advanced weapons had forced adaptation, but not strategic revision. The Allied system had absorbed the shock without altering direction. What mattered was not the brilliance of any single machine, but the continuity of effort across months and years. The breakthroughs were acknowledged, studied, and cataloged. They were not credited with altering the war's course. In numbers, the story was stark. Advanced aircraft appeared in dozens, while Allied equivalents appeared in thousands. Heavy tanks fought bravely but were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outlasted. Rockets destroyed buildings but did not destroy production. Scale defeated spectacle. Germany's breakthroughs ended the war not as game changers but as warnings. They illustrated how innovation without integration becomes burden rather than leverage. They demonstrated that the future, arriving early, cannot save a present that has already lost its structure. By the time Germany surrendered, the meaning of these weapons had shifted. They were no longer instruments of hope. They were artifacts. They marked the boundary between what was technically possible and what was strategically relevant. That boundary had moved during the war, and Germany's breakthroughs had crossed it too late. The world would remember the shock, but the war had been decided by something quieter. And as post-war analysis deepened, that quiet force, systems, scale, endurance, would become the focus of lessons learned, shaping not only how future wars were planned, but how innovation itself was understood. Those lessons would not condemn ingenuity. They would place it in context. Continue to Section 2 of Aftermath. 5. Aftermath. Section 2. How history judged the shock. In the years that followed the war, Germany's breakthroughs drew intense attention. Engineers examined wreckage, military analysts studied performance data, historians debated what might have happened if these weapons had arrived earlier in greater numbers or under different circumstances. The fascination was understandable. Germany had built machines that seemed to belong to a later era. Jet aircraft redefined speed, rockets hinted at a future beyond conventional warfare, advanced armor and guidance systems pushed the limits of what wartime industry could produce. In isolation, these achievements were extraordinary, but history judged them not in isolation. Post-war analysis placed Germany's breakthroughs within the wider framework of how wars are actually decided. When examined alongside production statistics, logistics reports, training pipelines, and operational timelines, the picture sharpened. The breakthroughs had not failed technologically, they had failed structurally. Military studies conducted after 1945 consistently reached the same conclusion. Germany's advanced weapons forced tactical adjustments but did not compel strategic change. Allied planning documents show continuity before, during, and after their appearance. Targets shifted, escorts adapted, timelines held. The war's direction remained stable. This mattered deeply for how innovation would be understood going forward. Future military planners absorbed a critical lesson. Novelty without integration cannot decide modern war. A weapon must exist within a system capable of sustaining it, fueling it, repairing it, replacing it, and deploying it repeatedly under pressure. Without that system, even the most advanced technology becomes episodic. Germany's breakthroughs illustrated this principle vividly. They arrived late into a war already dominated by scale and continuity. They demanded conditions that no longer existed. They consumed resources that could not be spared. They offered momentary advantage where sustained leverage was required. In contrast, Allied power appeared almost unremarkable in hindsight. Its strength lay not in individual brilliance but in institutional endurance. The Allies did not rely on a single turning point. They built an environment where turning points accumulated gradually, almost invisibly, until resistance collapsed. This interpretation reshaped memory. Germany's breakthroughs remained admired, even romanticized.
They inspired post-war development in aviation, rocketry, and engineering. Many concepts would reappear decades later under very different conditions, supported by mature systems and abundant resources. But admiration did not translate into vindication. The war did not prove that Germany was right too early. It proved that Germany misunderstood what timing, scale, and support truly meant. The future could not be imported into a collapsing present and expected to function. Historians increasingly emphasize this distinction. They noted that Germany's obsession with breakthroughs reflected not technological optimism, but strategic desperation. Each new weapon carried emotional weight disproportionate to its actual impact. Hope concentrated where structure had failed. The Allies, by contrast, treated innovation cautiously. New technologies were introduced only when they could be supported. Reliability was valued over novelty. Systems were allowed to mature before being stressed. This discipline shapes the post-war world. Military institutions, particularly in the United States, reorganized around systems thinking. Logistics, training, and interoperability became central concerns. Breakthroughs were still pursued, but only when they could be scaled and sustained. Germany's experience became a case study taught quietly but persistently. It demonstrated that the shock of the new fades quickly in a war fought by factories, supply lines, and replacement pools. It showed that awe can coexist with defeat, and it revealed how easy it is to mistake admiration for effectiveness. By the time the Second World War settled into history, Germany's breakthroughs occupied a strange place. They were neither dismissed nor celebrated uncritically. They were understood. They stood as markers of what happens when innovation outruns the system meant to carry it, when brilliance is asked to substitute for endurance, when the extraordinary arrives into a war that has already chosen continuity over surprise. The world remembered the shock, but history recorded the result, and that record prepared the ground for a final reflection, one that looks beyond Germany's experience to the broader truth revealed by the war, that modern conflict is decided less by what astonishes us than what persists when astonishment no longer matters. Germany's breakthroughs shocked the world because they arrived wrapped in promise of the future. They looked faster, stronger, smarter than anything that had come before. For a moment, they made observers believe that history could still be bent by brilliance alone. But the Second World War revealed something quieter and far more decisive. Modern war does not end when the future appears early. It ends when one side can no longer continue. Germany's great mistake was not inventing too much. It was believing that invention could replace endurance. Breakthroughs were traded as answers instead of additions, as salvation rather than support. Each new weapon carried the burden of expectation that once belonged to strategy, logistics, and time. That burden was impossible to carry. The Allies understood something different. They did not ask whether a weapon could astonish. They asked whether it could be supplied, repaired, replaced, and repeated, day after day, under pressure, without pause. They built systems that assumed failure and absorbed it. They planned for fatigue, loss, and delay. They accepted that victory would not arrive in a moment, but through accumulation. This difference decided the war. Germany proved that technology can outrun its era. The Allies proved that war rewards what survives friction. Shock fades. Adaptation does not. Awe gives way to arithmetic. In the end, the side that can keep going inherits the battlefield. History does not dismiss Germany's breakthroughs. It studies them carefully. Many would shape the decades that followed, once the systems to suppress them finally existed. But the war itself delivered a clear verdict. Innovation without integration cannot change outcomes already governed by scale and continuity. The world remembers the roar of jet engines and the sudden silence of rockets falling from the sky. It remembers the shock. What it must also remember is what followed. Factories that never stopped. Convoys that kept arriving. Training pipelines that replaced loss with persistence. Those forces were less visible. They were also unstoppable. Germany's breakthrough showed what was possible. The Allies showed what was decisive. And in that contrast lies one of the clearest lessons the Second World War left behind. The future does not win wars, unless the present can carry it.